I want to start by saying I almost didn't write this down. Not because I was afraid. I wasn't, not really. More because I figured people wouldn't believe it. You know how that goes. You see something with your own eyes and you can already hear the voices in your head saying, that's not how things work, or you must have misread the situation. But I was there. I was standing maybe 12 feet from the delegation platform when it happened. And I've been in enough rooms, enough diplomatic spaces, enough tense little bubbles where the wrong word can break a treaty or start something worse, to know when a moment is real. This was real. So here it is, all of it. I should back up a little. My name's Yusuf Marin. I've been with the Earth Diplomatic Corps for 11 years now, which means I've spent roughly a third of my adult life in spaces that smell like recycled atmosphere and artificial light, surrounded by beings who look at humans the way you might look at a stray cat that somehow wandered into a board meeting. Curious, a little amused, mildly concerned about where it's been. I'm not a negotiator. I want to be clear about that. My job is observation and documentation. I sit at the edge of rooms and I watch and I write things down. I've been called a glorified secretary by people who don't understand what observation actually means in a high-stakes diplomatic environment, and I've stopped being bothered by that. The people who say it have never seen what a single missed detail can cost. The day in question was the 43rd session of the Proxima Convocation, a trade summit that had been grinding along for about 6 weeks by then, the kind of marathon diplomatic event that starts with grand speeches and ends with everyone too exhausted to be idealistic anymore. The convocation brings together member species of what's officially called the Interstellar Commerce Accord. There are 14 member species. Humans have been provisional members for 9 years. Provisional. That word matters, I'll come back to it. Valerian Station is old. That's the first thing you notice when you board it. Not old like a neglected building is old. Old the way mountains are old, the kind of old that has weight and smell and a kind of gravity that has nothing to do with physics. It was constructed by the Velarith maybe 400 years ago, which in galactic timelines barely qualifies as recent. But the stone, and it is actual stone, some kind of crystalline mineral they harvest from asteroid belts, has been worn smooth by what must be generations of feet and hands and things that aren't exactly feet or hands, but serve the same purpose. The 7th orbital ring is where the diplomacy happens, not the flashy stuff, not the opening ceremonies or the media events. The actual work. The rooms up there are small and close, and the lighting is a compromise between what 7 different species can comfortably see in. For humans, it means everything looks slightly greenish, like you're underwater. I've been stationed at Session 43 for 2 days before anything interesting happened. Most of it was trade route logistics, which is exactly as exciting as it sounds. There's a particular back and forth the Korathi love to do where they propose terms. The Celevrian delegation objects on procedural grounds. The Korathi rephrase, and then everyone takes an hour break while translators compare syntax. I've watched this happen 14 times in 6 weeks. I've started counting the tiles on the ceiling. The interesting part started with the arrival of Senator Veth Kalorian. She came in on the 3rd morning of Session 43, and she came in the way powerful people do, not fast, not aggressive, just with this absolute certainty that the room would accommodate her. Senator Kalorian is Velarith. She's been in interstellar politics for something like 40 years, which in Velarith terms makes her moderately experienced. In human terms, it makes her a legend. She's tall, all Velarith are tall by human standards, but Kalorian has this particular quality of height that goes beyond measurement. Something in how she carries herself. Her skin is the pale blue-gray that Velarith skin goes when they're in formal mode. It shifts with their emotional state, I've learned. And her eyes are the particular shade of silver that indicates she's paying full attention to everything. Which, with Velarith, is a warning if you're standing on the wrong side of an argument. She sat down at the primary delegation chair and immediately began reviewing documents with the kind of focus that made it very clear she'd read them 6 times already and was looking for something specific. And then the translator situation happened. So I should explain how translations work at the convocation. Each species sends certified translators, beings or AIs who are licensed by the Accord to interpret not just language, but context, emotional register, diplomatic implication. The certification process is intense. A human translator who wants Accord certification needs to pass 16 different competency tests and demonstrate working fluency in at least 3 non-human linguistic frameworks. The human delegation had sent 3 certified translators to this session. The senior among them was a man named Cale Oren. I want to describe Cale because how he looks is relevant to what happened next, and I'm trying to write this down honestly rather than clean it up into something more comfortable. Cale is 34 years old. He's from a small community in coastal Oregon, which means nothing to most of the beings in that room except that it's on Earth, which is in a star system in a part of the galaxy that most member species genuinely cannot point to on a chart without checking their data feeds. He's not tall, not short either, just average in that way that doesn't get noticed. Brown hair, medium length, a little unkempt because he'd been working 18-hour translation prep days for the past week. He has this quality of stillness when he's working. When he's listening, he doesn't fidget, doesn't shift, he just receives. You could mistake it for blankness if you didn't know what to look for. He'd been cleared for the session, his credentials were logged and verified, and he was seated at the translation station adjacent to the primary delegation table, standard positioning. When Senator Calorian looked up from her documents, looked at him and said something. I wasn't close enough to hear it directly. What I heard was the secondary translation feed in my earpiece, which caught it a half-second later. She said, in what I can only describe as a tone of polite but absolute finality, "Who authorized a junior-level human for this tier? This session concerns primary commerce accord revisions. I need a Tier 3 translation specialist." The Earth delegation's senior attaché, a woman named Dr. Priya Vasandani, straightened slightly. She responded that Cale Oren was, in fact, Tier 3 certified, had been cleared for the session by Accord protocols, and that his credentials were on file with the Convocation Administration. Calorian looked at Cale again. The look was, I've been trying to find the right word for this for weeks now, clinical. The way you might look at a piece of equipment you've been handed and aren't quite sure meets the specifications for the job. She said, with a kind of patience that had no warmth in it at all, I've reviewed the Earth delegation's certification records. The highest active translation rating from your species is 3.2. This session requires consistent 3.5 performance under pressure. I'm requesting a replacement with a Korathi or Celevrian specialist or an Accord-approved AI unit. And then this is the part that settled into the room like a stone into still water, she said. No offense is intended. It's simply a matter of capability thresholds. No offense is intended. I've heard that phrase in a lot of rooms over 11 years. It's never not offensive. What it actually means is, the offense is so obvious I don't need to dress it up. Cale didn't react. That stillness I mentioned, it didn't break. He just sat with his hands on the table, and he looked at her, and then he looked down at his console, and his expression was neutral in a way that seemed like it required some effort to maintain. Dr. Vasandani made one more attempt. She cited Oren's specific scores, his prior session performance, his approval documentation. Senator Calorian stopped her with a small gesture, the Velarith equivalent of a politely closed door. I'm sure his record is adequate for standard exchanges. This is not a standard exchange. We will recess until a suitable specialist is arranged. I apologize for the inconvenience to your delegation. She stood and she walked out, not in a rush, just done. The room sort of held its breath for a second. And then everyone started moving at once, the low murmur of aides and assistants and secondary officials all suddenly having urgent things to do. And I caught Cale's face in the moment before he got up from his station. He wasn't angry. That's the thing that surprised me. I would have been angry. I would have had my jaw tight and my hands clenched, and I would have been thinking about everything I wanted to say. He just looked tired and thoughtful, like he was working something out. The recess was supposed to last 90 minutes. It lasted closer to 3 hours, because the Accord's translation specialist roster is not exactly overflowing with beings who can cover primary commerce, Accord terminology, in human diplomatic context, at a 3.5 rating, while also being immediately available on a space station in the Proxima system with 6 hours' notice. I spent the recess in the Observer Lounge on Sublevel 3, which has a window that looks out on the approach lanes to the station. Ships coming and going, all the time, a kind of constant mechanical traffic that's weirdly soothing when you've been in rooms full of political tension for 6 weeks. There are a few humans who hang around the Observer Lounge, liaison staff, junior attachés, a communications tech named Benny who's been stationed at Velaryon for 14 months and has strong opinions about the quality of the food dispensers. Benny came and sat next to me about 20 minutes into the recess. "You saw that thing with Oren?" he said. "I was in the room." "That's pretty cold. Calorian's been doing it all session from what I hear, different forms of it, little comments about provisional membership, capability questions." He picked up whatever was in his cup and looked at it with mild suspicion. "Oren's legitimately one of the best translators we have." "I know. His Deathworld file is active too," Benny said, kind of offhand, like he was just noting something he'd seen. "Station admin has it flagged. Doesn't come up much because nobody here looks at human files past the translation credentials." I looked at him. "What do you mean his file is active?" Benny shrugged. "I mean he's current classified, still flagged in the system. He grew up in one of the full classification zones. Oregon Coastal, I think." Another sip. "Weird thing to be relevant for a translation gig." He wasn't wrong. Deathworld classification comes from the Accord's Environmental Threat Assessment System, a categorization structure the Accord species developed to track which homeworlds require elevated biological response protocols when members of those species visit other stations. Earth as a whole has a baseline Deathworld classification that gives most non-human species mild anxiety. But there are zones within Earth's population that carry individual classifications, people who grew up in environments that the assessment system flags as being at or above threshold for sustained biological hazard exposure. Coastal Oregon doesn't sound dangerous if you grew up there. From an Accord biological assessment standpoint, the data says something different. Most of the time, it genuinely doesn't come up. You don't need to know if someone is current classified to have them translate trade agreements. But the file is there, and like I said, nobody ever looks at human files past the translation credentials. Almost nobody. The session reconvened in the late afternoon, station time. Senator Calorian returned with a Celevrian translation specialist, a tall, pale being named Cyril, who has about 40 years of Accord certification, and what I can only describe as the energy of someone who has translated their way through every boring summit in recorded history, and is slightly above being tired of it. Cale Oren returned too. This is the part I don't think Senator Calorian anticipated. Dr. Vasandani had requested, through proper channels, that Oren remain present in an observational capacity, standard practice for any translator who's been active on a session file, since continuity of context matters and the departing translator's notes are part of the session record. Calorian hadn't objected, because there was no procedural reason to object. He'd just be sitting there. He sat at the secondary translation station, not at the primary table anymore, slightly off to the side, with his notes and his console and his stillness. Cyril took the primary translation position, and the session resumed. For about an hour, everything was fine. Commerce Accord revision discussion, primary Article 6, subclause arrangements for energy commodity routing through contested deep space lanes. Dense material, important genuinely but dense. Cyril was doing solid, competent work. The exchanges moved along. And then the Korathi delegate raised the question of Human Shipping Guild access to the new contested lanes. This is where it got complicated. The Korathi language has what linguists call a stratified courtesy framework. Basically, there are different registers of speech that carry different levels of implied social standing. It's not just formal versus informal. It's multiple tiers of acknowledged status, and the register you use when addressing or discussing another party is itself a statement about how you perceive their standing. Getting it wrong isn't just an embarrassing translation error. Getting it wrong, in the context of a commerce negotiation, can imply a position that hasn't been stated and that neither party intended. The Korathi delegate was raising a legitimate procedural question about human shipping access. He was asking it in what I later found out was the third courtesy register, which implies, roughly, that the party being discussed is recognized, but their standing in the matter is advisory rather than primary. Third courtesy, not hostile, but not equal either. Cyril translated it. Now Cyril is a good translator. Cyril did not make a gross error, But Searle translated the third courtesy framing into what amounted to a neutral position phrasing in standard accord common speech, basically flattening the courtesy register, because a fully accurate rendering would require a lengthy contextual footnote, and the session was already long. This is a judgment call that translators make. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it matters enormously. It mattered because when the Korathi delegate's question came out in accord common as a neutral inquiry about advisory input from provisional member Earth guilds, Senator Kalorian, and this was the moment, nodded along, and moved to use that framing to establish a procedural note that would have locked Earth's shipping guilds into advisory status for the lane access review. It was, technically, within her authority. The procedural note she was moving toward would have referenced the session translation as its grounding, and if the translation had accurately reflected the courtesy register, there would have been room to object. But the neutral rendering made it look clean. And here is where Cale Oren spoke. He didn't stand up, he didn't raise his voice. He pressed the secondary translator's notification indicator on his console, a small light that signals a translation note from a non-primary translator, and he said, quietly and very precisely, "Chair recognition requested. Secondary translator notation. The preceding Korathi exchange contained a third courtesy register framing. The translation provided was accurate in content but neutral in register. The standing implication of the original phrasing is not preserved in the neutral rendering. For procedural purposes, the distinction may be material." Silence. Senator Kalorian looked at him. Searle looked at him. The Korathi delegate, Kreth Halavan, a large being who has been in accord negotiations for something like 60 years, and who does not typically display much visible reaction, turned in his seat and looked at Cale Oren with an expression I can only describe as suddenly focused. Senator Kalorian said, with a tone that was still controlled but had developed an edge, "The primary translation for this session has been certified. Secondary observational notes are not procedurally binding and do not constitute an objection." Cale said, "I'm not making an objection, Senator. I'm making a notation. The session chair can determine its procedural weight." The session chair was a Velaruth named Counselor Orath, who had been looking increasingly tired for approximately 6 hours, and who now looked like she'd been handed something she hadn't expected. She said, "The notation is received. Delegate Halavan, do you wish to clarify the register context of your preceding inquiry?" Kreth Halavan said, and I watched the Celevrian translator's expression very carefully at this point. He said something in Korathi that I did not understand. What I heard in my earpiece feed in the standard rendering was, "The human translator is correct. I used the third courtesy register. I should clarify what I meant by it." And then he spent about 4 minutes clarifying. His clarification was that he had used the third courtesy register not to imply advisory standing for Earth's guilds, but because he was uncertain, within Korathi diplomatic custom, what register was appropriate for a provisional member. It was, he said, a question of uncertainty rather than dismissal. He'd been unsure whether to address human interests at the second or third register, and had defaulted to third as the more cautious choice, not meaning to imply diminishment. And this distinction, this difference between uncertain and dismissive, was, in the context of a shipping lane access negotiation, not small. Because if the Korathi delegation was uncertain about Earth's standing, the appropriate response was a discussion. If they were treating Earth's interests as advisory, the appropriate response was an objection. These are different situations. They lead to different outcomes. Senator Kalorian had been moving to treat it as advisory. The correct response was a discussion, and the notation that unlocked that correct response had come from the human translator she dismissed from the primary table 2 hours ago. The room was very quiet for a moment. I'm not exaggerating when I say it was the kind of quiet that has texture to it, the kind that everyone in the room recognizes as significant, even beings who don't know exactly why yet. Counselor Orath called a procedural pause. During that pause, 3 things happened that I watched from my observer position in real time. First, Senator Kalorian looked at Cale Oren with an expression that had changed. It wasn't embarrassment exactly. Velaruth faces don't do embarrassment quite the way human faces do. It was more like reassessment, like the motion of something being recalibrated. Second, Searle, the Celevrian translator who'd been doing the primary work, leaned slightly toward Kale and said something quiet that my earpiece didn't catch. Kale nodded once. Searle looked at the table. Whatever was said, it didn't seem hostile. Third, Kreth Halavan's aide, a younger Korathi who'd been sitting 2 seats behind the main delegation, walked from their section to the Earth delegations area, found Dr. Vasandani, and spoke to her for about 90 seconds. I couldn't hear it. I could see Dr. Vasandani's expression shift, in a way that suggested she was being told something that required careful attention. The procedural pause lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, the session chair announced that the Korathi delegation wished to continue the lane access discussion under the second courtesy register, explicitly acknowledging Earth's shipping guilds as primary interested parties rather than advisory participants. It was a material change. It meant that Earth's guilds would have direct input into the route agreements rather than being consulted after the fact. In practical terms, over a 5-year commerce cycle, the difference in revenue and route access was significant enough that someone in the Earth Trade Ministry was going to have a very good day when this session report reached them. All of that from a translation notation that took maybe 45 seconds to deliver. After the session wrapped, about 2 hours later, because once you establish the second courtesy framework, you have to actually redo some of the lane access discussion with accurate standing, acknowledged. Most people started filing out and gathering their things, and the usual post-session shuffle began. I was making my way toward the exit when I noticed that Senator Kalorian had not left. She was standing near the door of the chamber, which is unusual for her. She's not the type to linger. She was talking to someone. She was talking to Kale Oren. I'm not good enough at lip-reading Velareth to know what she was saying. I could see her expression. The clinical quality I mentioned earlier was gone. She was talking to him with something that I can only describe as direct attention, the kind she'd been giving her documents when she first sat down, but pointed at him. Kale was listening, that stillness again. He said something short, 2 or 3 sentences. She replied, he nodded. And then she left. I caught Kale on his way out, on the transit corridor between the chamber and the delegate lifts. What was that? I said. He looked at me. He's not someone who drops his neutrality easily, but he looked like he might be willing to say something. She asked if I'd been tracking the register inconsistencies through the whole session, or just that one. What do you say? The truth, that I'd been tracking them since day 1 of session 43, and there were 4 others that could have been material if they'd been invoked procedurally. He paused. She asked to see my notes. I stared at him. Did you give them to her? I gave her the flagged entries. She can review them before session 44. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder. She's not bad at her job, Yusuf. She just didn't look at the right file. The right file? The Deathworld classification. Coastal Oregon. I grew up during the climate surge years. You know what that means for a kid growing up in the coastal zone during those years. You learn to pay attention to things other people aren't paying attention to yet. You learn to notice what the surface reading is missing. He half smiled, which is the most expression I'd ever seen on his face in 6 weeks. Languages are like weather systems. You don't just translate what the words say. You translate what the pressure is doing. He went into the lift. I stood in the corridor for a second. You don't just translate what the words say. You translate what the pressure is doing. I've been in this job for 11 years. I've worked with translators on 6 different stations, in 4 different regional convocations, in diplomatic sessions that ranged from mildly awkward to very nearly catastrophic. I've never heard anyone describe translation like that. The next morning, session 44 had a different configuration. Kale Oren was back at the primary translation station. I don't know exactly what sequence of administrative requests made that happen. Dr. Vasandani was already at her desk when I arrived, and her expression was the kind that said something had been arranged, and she wasn't going to discuss the details, but he was there. Senator Kalorian arrived and looked at him, and did not call for a replacement. She sat down, opened her documents, and said, in what I was later told was the precise accord common phrasing for acknowledging a peer specialist. Translator Oren, I reviewed your notation logs from sessions 40 through 43. Your flagged register inconsistencies are accurate. I'd like to establish a secondary review protocol where your flags are cross-referenced with the primary translation output before procedural motions are entered. Kale said, "That works for me." Just that, no victory in it, no edge, just practical acknowledgement. Cyril, the Celevrian translator who'd been brought in the previous day, had been retained for session 44 as well. Dual translation coverage is actually standard practice for high-stakes commerce revisions. It had just been overlooked in the rush to replace Kale. So now there were two primary translators with a cross-reference protocol. The session ran more smoothly than any of the previous 43. I know that's a small thing. In the context of a galactic-scale trade summit, the session ran smoothly doesn't feel like a world historical event. But I keep coming back to the specific, concrete thing that happened. A woman with 40 years of interstellar political experience and the institutional authority to dismiss a human translator from a room without anyone formally objecting had made that decision. And then a notation that took 45 seconds to deliver had changed the course of a shipping lane negotiation. And then she had asked to see his notes. And his notes were accurate. And she knew that. What I've been thinking about, in the weeks since session 43, is the phrase she used when she dismissed him. Capability thresholds. She wasn't being cruel. I want to be honest about that. Senator Calorian is not a cruel person. I've watched her work for 6 weeks, and she's blunt sometimes, and she has high standards, and she doesn't suffer slow thinking, but there's no malice in her. When she said it was a matter of capability thresholds, she believed it. She'd looked at a number, 3.2, the Earth delegation's average certification rating, and she'd made a calculation. The number wasn't wrong. That average is accurate. What the number didn't capture was Kale Oren. And what Kale Oren is, specifically, is someone who grew up in an environment that required him to process multiple simultaneous layers of information from an early age. Coastal Oregon in the climate surge years meant reading ocean conditions, weather patterns, community resource pressures, a social environment that was tight and stressed and required constant navigation. He told me once later that his grandmother used to say the coast taught you to read what the water was thinking before you could read what it said. He applied that to languages, all of them, the register beneath the register, the pressure behind the word. That is not something that shows up as a certification number. It's the kind of thing that the Accords assessment system would never look for in a translation credential. But it shows up in the Deathworld classification file. Because the Deathworld classification file doesn't just list threat levels, it lists environmental exposure data. What a person grew up in. What kind of complexity they were required to process just to navigate daily life. Nobody looked at that file. The number said 3.2. The file said something else entirely. And the gap between those two things, between the number someone looked at and the thing the number didn't capture, almost cost Earth's shipping guilds a decade of route access. I filed my observer record the evening of session 44. Standard documentation, nothing editorialized, just the sequence of events. But I added a note at the end that isn't technically part of the official record. Call it a personal annotation. The moment of dismissal was not extraordinary in itself. Similar dismissals occur throughout multi-species diplomatic spaces, based on perceived capability hierarchies that reflect historical data more than present reality. What was extraordinary was the silence in which it was received, the patience with which the dismissed party continued to observe, and the precision with which he identified the exact moment where his observation became necessary. The question is not whether Senator Calorian was wrong to apply capability thresholds. The question is whether the thresholds she was applying were measuring the right things. In 11 years of observation work, I have found that the answer to that question is almost always, not entirely. I ran into Kale one more time before the convocation wrapped. We were in the observer lounge, the one with the window on the approach lanes. Evening station time, ships still moving, that constant traffic. I asked him if he was going to stay on with the Corps after Valerian. He said he had another session scheduled in 8 months, somewhere in the Inner Accord territory. Closer to the Corps, higher stakes sessions, primary Accord business that matters for the long-term membership review. The provisional membership review, I said. Yes, that matters to you. He looked at the window for a second, at the ships, My grandmother lived long enough to see first contact, he said. She used to watch the feeds from the initial sessions. She said it felt like the ocean knew water you didn't know yet. She said the only way to learn new water was to pay attention to what it was telling you before you decided you understood it. He picked up his cup. We've been provisional for 9 years. Some of them still don't know what we're telling them. Some of them will figure it out. He paused. Some of them already have. 3 weeks after session 44 concluded, I received a data packet from the Convocation Administration. Inside, it was a notification from Senator Veth Kalorian's office. The notification stated that she had filed a formal recommendation with the Accord's Translation Certification Bureau to initiate a review of Earth Delegation Certification Assessment criteria. Specifically, she had recommended that the environmental complexity processing data contained in Earth species Deathworld classification files be integrated into the Translation Capability Assessment framework. She had included, as a supporting reference, a 32-page analysis. She had not written the analysis herself. She had requested it from Cale Oren, and he had submitted it the day after session 44 wrapped. 32 pages, on the gap between what the numbers measure and what the file actually contains. I imagine he'd been thinking about it for a while. I still think about the moment she walked out of that chamber, the finality of it, the absolute certainty that the threshold had been assessed and the outcome was clear. And I think about Cale Oren sitting at the secondary station with his notes. Not angry, not crushed, just working. Paying attention to what the pressure was doing. There's a phrase I heard once from a Velareth archivist, one of those older station staff members who's been here so long she's become part of the furniture. She said something in her language that the translation feed rendered as, "The most dangerous thing in a room is the one that no one bothered to classify correctly." She was talking about a species, actually, not humans, some other species from an older conflict, but I've been turning it over ever since. The most dangerous thing in a room is the one that no one bothered to classify correctly. Not dangerous in the way that makes people afraid. Dangerous in the way that changes things, quietly, from a secondary station in 45 seconds. That's what I saw. That's what I wrote down.